The sun was beating down hard on the downtown market that Saturday afternoon. It was the kind of hot that makes the air shimmer and stick to your skin. The market was usually a place full of life, with the smell of fresh fruit, roasting coffee, and the sound of people bargaining for clothes. But for the two boys standing on the small wooden stage at the far end of the square, the day felt like a slow-motion disaster. There were only two of them up there. They were supposed to be a trio. One boy was sitting behind a drum set, wiping sweat from his forehead with the back of his arm every few seconds. The other was standing in the center, holding a heavy electric bass guitar. They looked tired and they looked nervous. Normally they had a third friend, a piano player, who tied all their music together. But an hour before the show was supposed to start, they got a text message. He was sick. He had a high fever and couldn't get out of bed. Just like that, their full, rich sound was cut in half. They tried to make the best of it. They really did. The drummer tapped a gentle rhythm on the hi-hat cymbal, trying to keep it smooth and cool. The bass player closed his eyes, trying to hear the piano parts in his head and play around them. But without those actual keys being pressed, the music felt empty. It was like trying to eat soup with a fork. You could kind of do it, but it wasn't satisfying, and it was a messy struggle. Every song they attempted seemed to fall apart. The beat was there, and the bass notes were deep and steady, but there was no melody. There was no voice to lead the song. The music just floated away into the noisy street. Ignored by everyone walking by. Down on the ground, the crowd was not impressed. It wasn't that the people were mean. They just didn't have a reason to stop. A man in a business suit rushed past, shouting into his phone, completely drowning out the quiet jazz beat. A mother pushing a stroller paused for a split second to look at the boys, but when the song hit a clumsy note, she shook her head and kept walking, looking for a juice stand. Even the street vendors, who usually like a bit of music, were too busy selling their goods to pay attention. The bass player felt his face getting red, and it wasn't just from the heat. He felt a knot of embarrassment tightening in his stomach. This was their big chance to play in the city, to show people what they could do. They had practiced for months for this moment, but now it felt like a joke. He looked over at the drummer. The drummer looked back at him, his eyes wide and panicked. They both knew they were losing the crowd. They were fighting a losing battle with just two instruments. They finished a song that was supposed to be upbeat and happy, but it sounded slow and sad without the piano. When the last note faded away, there was almost total silence. A few people clapped politely, but it was that awkward kind of clapping that sounds like rain hitting a tin roof, sparse and unsure. The bass player sighed heavily. He adjusted the strap on his shoulder, feeling the weight of the instrument dragging him down. He walked over to the microphone stand. The metal felt hot to the touch. He leaned in, and a sharp squeal of feedback blasted through the speakers, making everyone nearby wince and cover their ears. He cringed and quickly turned the volume down. "Sorry, folks," he said, his voice sounding a bit shaky over the speakers. He tried to laugh it off, but it sounded nervous. "We are having a bit of a rough day here. As you can probably hear, we are missing our piano player." He looked out over the sea of faces. People were drinking iced coffees, checking their watches, or looking at their phones. No one was looking at him. It felt like he was invisible. He felt a strong urge to just unplug and walk away, to call it quits and go home. But he couldn't do that. They had committed to playing for 2 hours, and walking away now would feel like admitting total defeat. "Look," he continued, rubbing the back of his neck, "we can't play our set list properly. It just doesn't work without the chords and the melody." He paused, looking around desperately, almost hoping for a miracle. "We really need someone to fill in. I know it's a long shot, but—" He pointed toward the back of the stage where the lonely keyboard sat covered in a thin layer of dust. "Is there anyone out there who knows how to play? We have the instrument right here. It's set up and ready to go. We just need hands." The crowd murmured a little. A few people looked up from their phones, curious to see if anyone would actually volunteer. The drummer stopped tapping his sticks and looked out into the crowd. Holding his breath, the bass player laughed again, short and dry. "Seriously," he said, his voice cracking just a little. "Can anyone play?" For a long moment, nothing happened. The city noise rushed back in, a car honked in the distance, a dog barked, and the wind rustled through the market banners. The bass player waited, counting the seconds in his head. 1, 2, 3. He was just about to step back from the mic, ready to mumble an apology and start another terrible, incomplete song, when he saw a movement near the front of the stage. The silence that followed the question was heavy, pressing down on the small stage like a thick wool blanket. The bass player held his breath, his heart hammering against his ribs, but he knew it was hopeless. Who carries a piano in their pocket? Who walks around a busy market on a Saturday afternoon, just waiting to jump up on a stage and save a struggling high school band? He felt a flush of heat rise up his neck, not from the sun, but from the sheer embarrassment of the situation. He had put his heart on his sleeve, and the world had just kept on walking. He let out a long, shaky breath and took a step back from the microphone. He was ready to mutter a quick, "Okay, never mind," and signal the drummer to start another song, even though it was going to sound just as empty and unfinished as the last one. He looked down at his shoes, preparing to retreat into his own little world of frustration, but then something changed in the atmosphere. It wasn't a loud noise or a shout that caught his attention. It was a movement near the front of the stage, a small break in the wall of indifferent shoppers. Someone was stepping away from the crowd. The bass player squinted against the sunlight, expecting to see a street performer maybe, or a bored music teacher looking for a quick laugh. Instead, he saw a child. She was a tiny thing, barely taller than the amplifier stacks that sat on the edge of the stage. She couldn't have been more than 6 or 7 years old. She was wearing a bright yellow sundress that fluttered in the gentle breeze, and her hair was pulled back in 2 neat, tight braids. In the middle of the dusty, gray concrete of the market, she looked like a little ray of sunshine that had accidentally tumbled down from the sky. The bass player froze. He exchanged a confused look with the drummer, who had stopped spinning his drumsticks and was now leaning forward over his snare drum, his eyebrows raised in total surprise. The little girl didn't smile or wave at the audience. She didn't look shy or scared. In fact, her face was set with a serious, calm expression that looked completely out of place on someone so young. She walked toward the side stairs of the stage with a deliberate, slow pace. She was holding on to the handle of a hard black case that looked almost as big as she was. It bumped against her leg with every step she took. The crowd, which had been so noisy and distracted just seconds ago, began to quiet down. People stopped looking at their phones. The man shouting into his phone paused his conversation. The mother with the stroller stopped and turned around. Everyone was watching this tiny figure make her way through the sea of legs. It was such a strange sight that it demanded attention. The bass player felt a wave of panic. Was she lost? Was she looking for her parents? Surely she wasn't coming up there. He leaned back over the microphone, keeping his voice gentle. He didn't want to yell at a little kid, but he needed to stop this before it got weird. "Hey there, little one," he said, forcing an awkward smile. "Are you lost? Where is your mom?" The girl didn't answer him. She didn't even look at him. She reached the stairs, which were steep and difficult for a grown man, let alone a small child. She grabbed the railing with one hand and dragged the heavy case up with the other, lifting it with a grunt of effort that showed just how heavy it was. The drummer stood up, ready to rush over and help her, thinking she was about to fall. "She's coming up," the drummer whispered, his eyes wide. "What is she doing?" The girl crested the top of the stairs and stepped onto the wooden platform of the stage. Up close, she looked even smaller. The top of her head barely reached the waist of the teenagers. She walked right past the bass player, ignoring him completely, and marched to the center of the stage. Now that she was standing still, the boys could see the case clearly. It wasn't a keyboard case, which wouldn't have made sense anyway, because there was no room for another keyboard. It was a violin case. The black covering was scratched and scuffed, showing signs of years of travel and use. The latches were brass and dull. The bass player crouched down on one knee, trying to get on her eye level. He felt a mix of pity and confusion. Maybe this was a prank? Maybe her parents were filming this from the crowd to put on the internet? It felt like a joke that he wasn't in on. "Listen, sweetie," he said softly. "This is a jazz show. We play complicated songs. And we asked for a piano player. We really need to get back to our set." The girl finally turned her head to look at him. Her eyes were dark and bright, and there was an intensity in them that made the bass player swallow his words. She didn't speak. She simply reached down and unsnapped the first latch of the case. Click. The sound was sharp and clear through the speakers, then the second latch. Click. She lifted the lid. Inside, resting on crushed blue velvet, was a violin. It was a beautiful instrument, made of wood that glowed a warm, honey-brown color. The neck was worn down, showing that it had been played thousands of times. Beside it lay a bow, the horsehair frayed slightly at the ends. The drummer sat back down on his stool, his mouth open slightly. "Dude," he whispered to the bass player. "Is she actually going to play?" The bass player stood up slowly, running a hand through his hair. He looked out at the crowd. The silence had turned into a murmur of curiosity. People were craning their necks to see what the little girl was doing. It felt like the entire market was holding its breath. "Okay," the bass player muttered, half to himself and half to the drummer. "Let's see what happens. But if she starts playing Twinkle, Twinkle, Little Star, we just politely stop her and thank her." The girl lifted the violin out of the case. She handled it with a care that was mesmerizing to watch. She tucked it under her chin, adjusting a small shoulder pad so that it fit perfectly against her collarbone. It looked like a natural extension of her body, like she was born with it there. She didn't fumble or struggle to find the right grip. Then she picked up the bow. She tightened the screw at the end with practiced fingers, testing the tension against her thumb. Finally, she dug a small cube of rosin out of the case and ran it up and down the bow hairs, slow and steady. She dash. The sound was quiet, but it was the sound of preparation. She turned to face the boys. For the first time, she gave a small nod. It wasn't a cute, playful nod. It was a professional cue. She was telling them she was ready. The bass player looked at his hands, then at the drummer. The fear was still there, but it was changing into something else. A strange spark of hope. Maybe they were about to be embarrassed even more. Or maybe, just maybe, the universe had heard his question after all. "You know any jazz?" The bass player asked, his voice trembling just a little. The girl didn't say a word. She just lifted the bow to the strings, closed her eyes for a split second to find the pitch in her head, and waited. She was waiting for them. The bass player looked down at the little girl, feeling a mix of confusion and pity. He wanted to believe that something magical was about to happen, but his brain wouldn't let him. She was just a child. She was wearing a dress with flowers on it, for crying out loud. In his mind, he was already preparing for the worst. He imagined a high-pitched screeching sound, like a cat fighting with a bag of metal cans. He imagined the crowd laughing, not with them but at them. He imagined the video going viral for all the wrong reasons. Titled, "High School Band Destroyed by 7-Year-Old." He glanced at the drummer, who was still standing behind his kit looking like he had seen a ghost. The drummer gave a small shrug and a helpless look that said, "Asterisk, what do we do?" Asterisk, the bass player let out a sigh that seemed to deflate his whole body. He decided he would be the nice guy. He would let her play one note, just to make her happy, and then gently tell her that the stage was dangerous and she needed to go find her parents. He crouched down on one knee again, bringing his face close to hers. Up close, he could see a small smudge of chocolate on her cheek and a stubborn determination in her eyes that reminded him of his own mother when she made up her mind about something. "Okay. Listen," he said, keeping his voice low so the crowd wouldn't hear him being mean. "This is really nice of you to want to help, but we play jazz. Do you know what jazz is? It's complicated. We don't play nursery rhymes." The girl didn't blink. She didn't look offended. She simply held the violin under her chin, her posture straight and tall. "We are going to play a song called Autumn Leaves." He continued, feeling a bit ridiculous explaining a classic jazz standard to a first grader. "It's in a minor key. It's actually kind of sad. You probably don't know it." The girl tilted her head slightly. She looked at him as if he was the one who didn't understand what was going on. She didn't say a word. Instead, she shifted her weight slightly and tapped her left foot against the wooden stage floor. Asterisk, tap, 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 asterisk. It was a slow rhythm. A heartbeat rhythm? Not too fast, not too slow. Just steady. The drummer's eyes narrowed. He recognized that tempo. It was perfect. It was exactly the speed they had been failing to find all afternoon. It was the kind of pace that let the music breathe. "Hey," the drummer whispered, leaning over his tom-toms. "She's got good time." The bass player looked at the tapping foot, then back at the girl. Okay, he mumbled. "But just for a minute, and if it sounds bad, we stop." "Deal?" The girl didn't nod. She just kept tapping. Tap, 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 tap. The drummer sat back down on his stool. He looked at the girl, then at his snare drum. He felt a strange pull in his chest. It was a risk. A huge risk. But nothing else they had done today had worked. The crowd was bored. The music was dead. Maybe this was exactly the crazy thing they needed. Slowly, carefully, the drummer brought his sticks down to the hi-hat cymbal. He matched her tapping. TSS, SS's, it was a soft, brushing sound like sandpaper on wood. Blending perfectly with the tapping of her small sneaker, the bass player's eyes widened. He looked at his friend. Asterisk, are you serious? His eyes asked. The drummer just stared at the girl, entranced by her focus, and kept the rhythm going. The bass player felt trapped. He couldn't let his drummer play with a little girl all by himself. He had to back him up, but he still felt sure this was going to be a train wreck. He felt his fingers shaking as he placed them on the thick strings of his bass. He decided to play the root note. Just the simplest note he could find. He would play it softly in the background, hoping to drown out any mistakes she made. He plucked the string. Thrum. The sound was deep and low, vibrating through the floorboards. It matched the tempo. It fit the drummer's brush. For a moment, that was all there was. Just the tapping foot, the brushing cymbal, and the deep bass note. The music was empty, waiting for a melody to fill it. The crowd, which had started to lose interest again when the boys stopped talking, suddenly perked up. People saw the small child with the serious face and the giant instrument. They saw the high school boys hesitating. They leaned in. The atmosphere shifted from bored indifference to curious suspense. It was like watching a tightrope walker step out onto the wire. Everyone wondered if she was going to fall. The bass player looked at the girl, ready to shake his head to signal stop the second she made a wrong move. He watched her bow hand. It was hovering over the strings, steady as a rock. She didn't look like she was about to play a game. She looked like she was about to go to work. She closed her eyes for a brief second, taking a deep breath that filled her small lungs, and then opened them again. Staring straight ahead at nothing, she didn't play the happy, childish notes the bass player expected. She didn't saw clumsily at the strings. She drew the bow across the violin with a smooth, firm stroke. The sound that came out was not a screech. It was a note so pure and clear that it seemed to cut right through the humid air. It was a G note, but it was rich and full, singing with a vibrato that wavered just enough to break your heart. It was the sound of experience, of soul, of something much older than the body holding the instrument. The bass player's mouth fell open. His hand froze on the neck of his bass. The drummer missed a beat, surprised, but then jumped right back in, a huge grin spreading across his face. The girl held the note, letting it hang in the air over the market. She was listening, feeling the vibrations, waiting for exactly the right moment to move. The tension on the stage was electric. The boys were no longer thinking about how bad their gig was. They were hanging on her every move. Terrified to make a sound that would break the spell she was weaving docked, she shifted her fingers on the neck of the violin, moving with a speed that looked impossible for someone so small. She played the next phrase of the song. It was fast, it was complex, and it was absolutely beautiful. She wasn't just playing Autumn Leaves, she was rewriting it, making it weep and soar all at the same time. The bass player shook his head in disbelief. He looked at the crowd. The man with the phone had lowered it to his side. The mother with the stroller was covering her mouth with her hand. The market had gone completely silent save for the music. He realized with a jolt of adrenaline that this wasn't a joke. This was real. And if he didn't start playing properly, he was going to be left behind. The moment the bow touched the strings, the air on the stage seemed to change. It wasn't just a sound. It was a feeling that washed over the wooden planks and vibrated right into the boys' chests. The bass player felt the hair on his arms stand up. He had expected a screech, a mistake, or a childish giggle. Instead, he was hearing something that sounded like pure emotion. He realized instantly that he had been wrong. This wasn't a game. This wasn't a joke. This little girl was a musician, and she was speaking a language that he had been trying to learn for years. The drummer felt it too. He stopped playing the cautious, soft rhythm he had started with. A grin broke across his face, stretching from ear to ear. It was a look of pure joy, the kind that only appears when you are surprised by something amazing. He dug his drumsticks in a little harder, hitting the snare drum with a sharp crack that perfectly matched the crispness of the violin. The bass player took a deep breath, letting go of his embarrassment. He stopped plucking the safe, boring notes he had been hiding behind. He felt a sudden surge of energy. He slid his hand up the neck of his instrument and found a walking bass line, a steady, moving rhythm that jazz musicians use to drive the song forward. When he joined in properly, the music clicked into place. It was like turning on a light switch in a dark room. Suddenly, they weren't three strangers on a stage anymore. They were a band. The girl didn't look at them, but she heard them. The boys could tell because as soon as the bass player started walking his line, she raised her chin and played a melody that danced right on top of it. It was incredible to watch. Her fingers were so small, yet they moved with the speed and precision of a spider. She was playing Autumn Leaves, but she wasn't playing it like it was written in a dusty old book. She was making it her own. She added little trills and turns, extra notes that decorated the melody like glitter on a card. Down in the crowd, the atmosphere shifted completely. Just a few minutes ago, the market had been a noisy, indifferent place. People were rushing, arguing, and ignoring the music. But now, the sound of the violin was cutting through all that noise. It was impossible to ignore. A man in a business suit who had been shouting into his phone slowly lowered the device. He forgot about his angry client. He forgot about the time. He just stood there, his mouth slightly open, listening to the sound of a child playing with the soul of an old master. The mother with the stroller had stopped walking. She reached down and gently covered her baby's ears, not because the music was loud, but because she didn't want the baby to start crying and ruin the moment. She was swaying side to side, caught up in the rhythm. Even the vendors were getting into it. The man selling hot dogs paused, his tongs hanging in midair, tapping his foot against the metal cart. The flower lady put down her watering can and leaned on her fence, closing her eyes to let the music wash over her on stage. The bass player looked at the drummer, and they exchanged a look of disbelief. This was the best they had played in months, maybe ever. They were playing better because they had to. They had to keep up with her. The little girl was setting the bar high, and they were jumping over it with everything they had. The song moved into the bridge, the part where the melody shifts and gets a little more complicated. The drummer took a small solo, rolling the sticks across the tom-toms in a thundering wave. The crowd ooh-oohed in appreciation. But as soon as he finished, the violin came back in. She didn't miss a beat. She jumped right back in with a high, soaring note that made people gasp. She was playing with her eyes closed now. Her head swayed from side to side, her braids flying. She wasn't thinking about what she was doing. She was feeling it. You could see the music moving through her small body. Her knees would bend on the low notes, and she would rise up on her tiptoes for the high ones. She was conducting the music with her whole being. The bass player felt a lump forming in his throat. He thought about all the times he had complained about practicing. He thought about how much he worried about looking cool or fitting in. And here was this tiny girl who didn't care about any of that. She just cared about the sound. She was giving the music everything she had, and in return, the music was giving her a voice that could stop a city. The sun began to dip lower in the sky. casting long, golden shadows across the stage. The heat of the day broke, replaced by a cool breeze that seemed to arrive exactly when the music slowed down. The trio played softer now. The bass notes were deep and rumbly, like a cat purring. The violin was soft and whispery, like a secret being told. The crowd had grown. There was a tight circle of people around the stage now, maybe 50 or 60 deep. No one was talking. No one was checking their phones. They were all just breathing together, listening to the conversation happening between the drums, the bass, and the violin. It was a moment of magic. A bubble of time where nothing else mattered but the sound. The girl opened her eyes for a second and looked at the bass player. She gave him the tiniest nod, almost invisible. It was a signal. She was ready to take it home. She was ready to bring this song to its end. The bass player nodded back. He tightened his grip on his instrument. The drummer sat up straight, raising his sticks high. They were going to finish this strong. They were going to give this crowd an ending they would never forget. The music was building up, climbing higher and higher like a plane taking off. The drummer was riding his cymbals, creating a shimmering wall of sound that crashed over the crowd in waves. The bass player was digging in deep, his fingers flying across the strings, playing notes he didn't even know he could reach. And in the center of it all was the little girl. She had her eyes squeezed shut, her head tilted back toward the sky. She wasn't holding anything back. Every note she played was packed with emotion. She played a flurry of fast, intricate notes that made the crowd gasp, her bow moving so fast it was just a blur of wood and horsehair. Then, just when it seemed like the song couldn't get any more intense, she hit the crescendo. She played a high, piercing note that rang out clear and true, cutting through the noise of the market like a laser. It was a sound of pure joy, a sound that felt like hope. She held that note. She held it so long that the drummer froze, his sticks hovering in the air. She held it until her lungs must have been burning, until the very air around the stage seemed to vibrate. And then, with a sharp, graceful flick of her wrist, she lifted the bow off the strings. Silence. It wasn't just quiet. It was a heavy, profound silence. The kind that happens when something so beautiful has just occurred that no one knows how to react immediately. The sound of the violin seemed to echo in everyone's ears. The businessman forgot his phone. The vendors stood frozen. The birds in the trees even seemed to stop chirping. For 3 long seconds, the world stopped turning. Then, the spell broke. A woman near the front let out a breath she didn't know she was holding. "Wow," she whispered. Suddenly, the applause erupted. It didn't start slow. It started like a thunderclap. People clapped until their hands stung. They cheered, whistled, and shouted, "Bravo!" The market was transformed. The indifference that had ruled the afternoon was completely gone, replaced by a wave of pure appreciation. Strangers were smiling at each other, sharing a look that said, "Asterisk, did you just see that?" Asterisk, the bass player looked at his hands, shaking his head in disbelief. He felt tears pricking the corners of his eyes, unexpected and overwhelming. He looked at the drummer, who was grinning so hard his face looked like it might crack. They had done it. Against all odds, they had turned a disaster into a triumph. But they knew, deep down, that they hadn't done it alone. The little girl had saved them, on stage. The little girl didn't take a bow. She didn't wave to the crowd or look for praise. She simply relaxed her shoulders, the tension leaving her small frame. The serious professional look on her face softened into a shy, gentle smile. She looked like a regular kid again, not a musical prodigy. She calmly loosened the hair on her bow and wiped the instrument. Down with a soft cloth from her case, the bass player finally found his voice. He walked over to her, crouching down, not caring that his knees were popping. He wanted to tell her how amazing she was. He wanted to ask her who her teacher was, how long she had been playing, where she learned to play jazz like that. He wanted to promise her a spot in the band forever. He started, his voice cracking slightly. "That was the most beautiful thing I've ever heard. Really, you saved us." The girl looked at him. Her dark eyes were sparkling with excitement, but she remained quiet. She seemed a little shy now that the music was over. She reached into the pocket of her bright yellow sundress and pulled out a small, folded piece of paper. It was torn from a larger sheet, probably from a notebook or a sketch pad. She held it out to him. "For you," she said softly. It was the first time she had spoken, and her voice was small and sweet. The bass player took the paper. He expected it to be a phone number, or maybe her parents' contact info, or perhaps an autograph request. He unfolded it carefully. It was written in purple crayon, in the careful, blocky handwriting of a young child. It wasn't a request for money or fame. It simply read, **, thank you for letting me play. I love jazz." Asterisk under the words, she had drawn a little smiley face and a music note. The bass player stared at the note. He felt a lump form in his throat the size of a golf ball. He looked up to thank her properly, to tell her that they should be thanking her. But she was already walking away. She snapped her violin case shut, grabbed the handle with both hands, and walked to the edge of the stage. The crowd, still clapping, parted to let her through like she was royalty. She hopped down the stairs and ran straight to a woman standing near the back, her mother. The mother had a camera in her hand, wiping tears from her eyes with the back of her other hand. She scooped the little girl up into a big hug, spinning her around. The bass player and the drummer watched from the stage. They didn't chase after her. They didn't ask for her autograph. They just watched them go, feeling a sense of peace settle over them. "Did that actually happen?" the drummer asked, sitting back down on his stool and twirling a drumstick nervously. The bass player looked down at the purple crayon note in his hand. He folded it up carefully and put it in his pocket, right next to his pick. "Yeah, man," he said, a genuine smile spreading across his face for the first time all day. "That actually happened." The crowd began to disperse, drifting back to their shopping, but the mood of the market had changed. People were talking to each other, laughing, energized by the music they had just heard. The boys packed up their gear slowly. They didn't feel tired anymore. They didn't feel like failures. They knew they would probably never see the little girl in the yellow dress again. They didn't even know her name. But as they carried their amps to the car, the bass player realized they had learned something more important than any music lesson. They learned that sometimes you have to be brave enough to ask for help. And sometimes help comes from the places you least expect it, even from a 7-year-old girl with a violin and a heart full of music. As they drove away, the empty spot where the keyboard used to be didn't feel empty at all. It felt filled with the memory of the best performance they ever had.